Hello and welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Last week we began looking at family law in the Law of Moses, laws concerning sexuality, marriage, divorce, remarriage, inheritance. We started looking last week at the many laws in the Law of Moses that forbid incest. And we looked at the situations in the ancient world that led to those laws being necessary. Today, we're going to finish looking at the sexual restrictions that we find in Leviticus chapter 18, and we'll see how all of these laws are connected back to the laws concerning worship and the cleanliness laws along the way. Our text for today is going to come from Leviticus chapter 18, verses 19 through 23. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness. You shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not lie with any animal, and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. Some of these prohibitions might need a little explaining, although we see all of these behaviors in the modern world, right? So it's not, maybe we should say it's not outside the pale, not beyond the pale, to understand that this is a temptation for some people. Again, if it's a temptation in the modern world, we can certainly imagine how it could be a temptation in the ancient world. Right? The desire to engage in some of these acts is just there in some people. In fact, when you look at all of the things named in the text, I think it's pretty safe to say that the vast majority of people can be tempted by at least one of those behaviors, even if the others on the list might completely repulse them. But the law gives us a very specific perspective on these behaviors. That will help us understand why these in particular are being regulated, why they're being prohibited, and why they're all being prohibited together in the same context. The fundamental principle behind all of these restrictions is ritual purity. Our first hint at this is in the first restriction that we read today. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness. Now, this ties us, in its language, and in what it regulates, directly back to the cleanliness laws that we studied a couple of weeks ago. Now, remember, the cleanliness laws take up Leviticus chapters 11 through 15, and we focused on one chapter concerning the dietary restrictions, and we looked at a couple of other places that deal with mixtures. In Leviticus chapter 15, which we didn't cover a couple of weeks ago, we read some additional restrictions, additional laws concerning the uncleanness of bodily discharges, mostly of a sexual nature, and genital discharges. Now, turn to Leviticus chapter 15. We'll start in verse 19. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. And if any man lies with her and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. All right, so like we said, this is in a context that deals with all kinds of bodily discharges, mainly genital discharges. And here we should note the law is not just picking on women. Right? So we're looking at the connection between this restriction against having menstrual sex and what the cleanliness laws say about menstruation. The law is not just picking on women here. About half of Leviticus chapter 15 deals with discharges from men, right? Particularly emissions, right? The general lesson of this chapter is that any kind of discharge makes a person unclean and therefore unfit to be in the Lord's presence, that is, in the tabernacle. And this is all summed up towards the end of the chapter, chapter 15, verse 31, as we studied a couple of weeks ago. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. All right, so cleanliness is, like we studied a couple of weeks ago, it teaches us about holiness and the idea that sin makes us unclean, sometimes even in ways that we don't intend. And we see this all through chapter 15, right? Nocturnal emissions, your period, those are things you can't really control. That's not something that you intend. It shows us in the law of Moses, uncleanness is, for lack of a better word, it's kind of the normal way of life, right? You spend more of your time unclean than clean, and ensuring your cleanliness so that you can appear before the Lord and offer sacrifices. That takes some doing, right? And that translates into a moral lesson about the nature of sin and how it separates us from God, and just how much effort is required to cleanse us of our sins. But like we said, a couple of weeks ago, these are kind of the moral training wheels for Israel. And the sexual restrictions that we just read in chapter 18 are connected back to these cleanliness laws. Right? Sex is a cleanliness issue, as it's presented in Leviticus 18. And it's presented this way in Leviticus 15 as well. Right? The warnings about uncleanness in Leviticus 15 includes a warning again about regular sexual activity. Right? If you look in chapter 15, verse 18, if a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them shall bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. All right, so in the law, any kind of sexual contact makes you ritually unclean, as you can't go to the tabernacle. You are separated from the presence of the Lord until you become clean. Right? Now, in this case, it's a relatively short-term thing. They have to bathe themselves, and they are unclean until evening, so they can go into the tabernacle the next day. But this isn't some isolated thing, by the way, just tucked away in Leviticus. This is something that we read elsewhere. We have an example in 1 Samuel 21, as David is fleeing from Saul. You look at the first 6 verses of 1 Samuel 21. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said to him, Why are you alone, and no one with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, The king has charged me with a matter, and said to me, Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I've charged you. I've made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here. And the priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest, Truly women have been kept from us, as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. All right, now we should note that Ahimelech's only concern here is whether or not David's men have had relations with women. And we should also take note of how David responds to Ahimelech. Right, he tells Ahimelech what his MO is. And he doesn't just say that his men abstain from women while on expedition. He says that they keep their vessels holy. And so he's picking up that same language of clean and unclean, teaching about holy and unholy that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and he's tying it to sex. And so here in 1 Samuel, just like in the law, we get this idea that any kind of sex act makes a person unclean, therefore unfit to stand before the Lord in the tabernacle. Now, we should note here, by the way, that, first off, what we're doing with this class is describing what we find in the law of Moses and trying to come up with some explanations for it, and then also looking at how things change from the law of Moses into the New Testament. And by making that connection, we start to see what the intention of the law is. Right? So is this something that is, it's meant to teach Israel about the moral law, right? Like the dietary laws, right? They teach Israel about the moral law, but they are not themselves the moral law, right? So that Jesus can come along later and just completely scrap the dietary laws. Does it function that way, or are the laws themselves part of the moral law? Now, in this particular instance, as we see the law basically saying that any kind of sexual activity, and even legitimate marital sex, makes a person unclean, unable to stand before the Lord, that's not something that we find in the New Testament. All right, now we'll see later on that the New Testament still ties sexual purity to worship, to fidelity to God, but it does not teach this particular thing that the law teaches, that, again, any kind of sexual activity makes a person unclean and unfit to worship, to stand before the Lord. In the New Testament, we find Paul, he does express a preference for celibacy in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but he does not take it all the way that the law takes it. He does not make it a matter of something that's unclean and unholy by definition, right? He doesn't at all say that marital sex makes a couple unclean, right? So that leads us to believe that it's actually something more like the dietary laws, right? It teaches about the moral law. So that leaves us with the same question that the dietary laws leave us with. Well, why does sex make someone unclean under the law? Right? What is it that we're learning, that Israel is supposed to learn about the moral law from these restrictions that are not carried forward into the New Testament? And again, here we're looking specifically at some of these clean and unclean laws dealing with sex. Not talking about the prohibitions in Leviticus 18. We're going to come back around to those. But I want us to see here that those restrictions, those prohibitions in Leviticus 18 are connected to these principles about clean and unclean. The prohibitions, we'll see, they are repeated in the New Testament. Not all of these lessons about clean and unclean are carried forward in the New Testament. So what is it in the law that makes someone unclean, even whenever they have, again, just legitimate marital sex? And I'll just say here at the outset, I do not have what I consider to be a satisfactory answer to that question. There are a couple of things that we can consider, so I'm just going to present some common explanations that you'll hear, explanations that have been used historically. But again, this is what I know, and it does not amount, at least in my view, to a coherent and satisfactory explanation of what all's going on. So the first thing that we can look at, like we said last week, procreation participates in God's creative act. Again, it's the first thing that God commands in Genesis chapter 1, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We know also from the creation account that something about that process becomes broken and twisted after the fall. All right, that's why in Genesis 3, the curse on Eve is pain and childbirth. Something is broken in a post-sin world. Something is broken about procreation. Now, is anything broken about it beyond pain and childbirth? It's not explicitly spelled out, but you could look at these laws in Leviticus, you could look at Leviticus 15, dealing with uncleanness, and you could extrapolate from that, and many have, right? It would explain the laws about nocturnal emissions and periods as essentially failed creative acts, right? That basically after the fall, procreation, sex in general, is just broken. It's just fundamentally broken and flawed. And all kinds of things about it go haywire, right? So you have things like nocturnal emissions and periods that that indicate a falling short of the creative act. And, perhaps that's what makes them unclean. And again, it might be that any kind of sex act after the fall is fundamentally twisted. It's a perversion of God's creative act, and that procreation only partially justifies the act, right? It's kind of a necessary evil, as it were. Again, that's something that you could extrapolate from the curse in Genesis 3 and some of these cleanliness laws in Leviticus 15. That was what many of the Western church fathers believed and taught, right? So you go back and you read Adkisson, you read Tertullian, you read pretty much all of the Western fathers, and they believed that sex was just inherently broken and just fundamentally bad, and it didn't even really matter what context it happened in, right? The marriage bed made it acceptable, right, if it was for procreation, but at least as far as the Western fathers are concerned, it's something that you have to be really suspicious about in any context, right? Outside of the marriage bed, of course, it's just flat out wrong, unacceptable. But even in the context of marriage, it becomes something where you have to tread very carefully, lest you fall into some kind of impurity. This is ultimately, of course, what led the Roman Catholic Church to the positions that it holds today concerning priestly celibacy and other sexual matters. I don't find that whole explanation to be entirely satisfactory. There are other possibilities to explain some of these things that deal specifically with menstruation, or why giving birth makes a woman unclean under the law, as we read in Leviticus 12. Possibly there is a connection with the cleanliness principle that the life is in the blood. All right, we read that early on in Genesis 9 as God gives Noah and the rest of mankind permission to eat the animals. The only restriction is you don't eat the blood, because the life is in the blood. And so we find all kinds of restrictions being built up in the law surrounding blood. And that might make sense of the cleanliness laws concerning menstruation. It doesn't, at least not to me, make intuitive sense out of the cleanliness laws that we read in Leviticus 12 about childbirth, because the law is, again, it's usually a prohibition against consuming the lifeblood, whereas in birth, one's doing exactly the opposite, right? The blood is not, it doesn't signify the ending of life. It's not the shedding of blood in that sense. It signifies the beginning of new life. So why the law would kind of lump those things together, which again, it doesn't explicitly do that in Leviticus 12. The law does not say a woman is unclean after childbirth because she's come in contact with blood and the life is in the blood. These are just attempts that have been made over the years to explain why in Leviticus 12 we read that childbirth makes a woman unclean. There's not really an explanation given. And I don't find that the life is in the blood argument makes a whole lot of intuitive sense. Again, it possibly can explain the uncleanness of menstruation under the law. It doesn't explain just the general principle of any kind of sex making you unclean under the law. But whatever the explanation may be, and I know I feel like that, ironically, that section of the lesson is probably not very fruitful, and I apologize for that. But whatever the explanation may be, whatever the reason, the motive may be, the law connects sexual activity with uncleanness. And so it is doubly true of sexual perversion. So if we come back around to where we started in Leviticus 18 and talking about these forbidden acts, if these other things that are not necessarily all of them forbidden acts, if they make you unclean, well, the forbidden acts make you doubly unclean, right? These acts, by the way, are presented in terms of their status before God. Right? Notice that adultery isn't just presented as infidelity to one's spouse. The problem is not just that you have made the woman an adulteress and that you have cuckolded her husband. The consequence of adultery, as it is presented in Leviticus 18, is that it makes a person unclean and therefore unable to approach the Lord. All right, now there's more to that, as we'll begin to see with the next prohibition in the text. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Now, it might seem curious to include a prohibition against sacrifice to Molech in the middle of a text about sex. It seems like Molech is just popping up out of nowhere, just out of left field in this. Let's make some sense of that, because there are several connections to be made here. And this is going to help us understand just the general nature of some of these prohibitions and the way that they're fit together. First, there is an idolatry-based connection between sexual perversion and sacrifice to Molech. And to help understand that, we should notice how the next prohibitions are characterized. So Leviticus chapter 18, verses 22 and 23, we'll read the next two prohibitions. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And you shall not lie with any animal, and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. So first off, we see, once again, the language of the cleanliness laws. Right? You shall not lie with any animal, and so make yourself unclean with it. So that is in view here. But we also see another term, abomination. Right? You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Toevah in Hebrew. It is a term that is used of idolatry in the law. Let's return for a moment to a passage that should be familiar to us. If you've been with this study for a while, this passage should be familiar from our study of idolatry several weeks ago. Deuteronomy chapter 12, beginning in verse 29. When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, that I also may do the same? You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. For every abominable thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Now you notice there a double connection with our text in Leviticus 18. All right, just as homosexuality is called an abomination in Leviticus 18, it's, idolatry is called an abomination in Deuteronomy 12, and in both of those texts you have child sacrifice singled out. Right, so there is a connection there, an idolatry-based connection, that sexual perversion is treated in the same way as idolatry. Right, and of course the relationship also works the other way around. Idolatry is referred to metaphorically as adultery against the God of Israel. This happens all over the prophets. You see it you see it very vividly in Ezekiel. You see it in Hosea. The whole premise of Hosea's ministry is built around this idea that adultery is an earthly stand-in that helps Israel understand the consequences of their idolatry. There's also a specific sexual angle to Molech worship that explains why this prohibition is here in our text in Leviticus 18. Child sacrifice in the ancient world is usually a fertility offering, right? And that might not make any sense to us today, but just like incestuous relationships, there's a certain logic to it in the ancient mind. Remember that in antiquity, most people, pretty much everyone, is a subsistence farmer. And once you hit a certain threshold, adding more people onto a plot of land does not make it any more fruitful. Right now, up to a certain point, adding more people does make it more fruitful. You have more people to work the land and get more produce out of the same amount of land. But you hit a certain point where that stops, right? First you hit diminishing returns, and then that relationship just flat out stops and turns the other direction. The more and more people you add to the land, the less productive it is overall. And once you get to that point, having another child means that everyone has less to eat. And to a subsistence farmer, less to eat is the difference between living hungry, which is the norm if things are going well, if you're a subsistence farmer. It's the difference between that on the one hand versus starving to death. Right? It's not the difference between going kind of hungry versus going a little bit more hungry. It's the difference between going hungry and just not going at all. At least that's the way it works in the ancient mind. Now, the message of faith is that God's going to take care of Israel. Right? Those promises are baked into the law all over the place. And we studied those in the narrative sections. God is going to take care of Israel. God's going to bless Israel, just like he blessed Jacob, right? With all kinds of fertility. His own personal fertility, the fertility of his livestock, the fertility of his crops. And God is going to bless the nation that bears his name in the same way, if they'll have faith in him. But faith is difficult. And to an ancient subsistence farmer, again, adding another child in the mix, eventually you hit a point where adding another child makes it look a whole lot like I'm going to starve to death. Now, at the same time, the ancients understood that the fertility of the land and the fertility of one's livestock depended on the divine. Right? Israel certainly understood it. Again, it's baked into their origin story. Right? God is with Jacob, and that's why he is blessed. God is with Isaac as well. That's why they're both blessed with increases in their crops and their livestock. And just like their father Abraham, they become very rich. Again, Israel obviously understands this connection between fertility and God. God is in control of fertility, ultimately. But even the pagans understood this. They had some inkling that fertility is connected to the divine, to whatever gods they happen to be worshiping. And so the solution that the ancients came up with was very close to Jonathan Swift's modest proposal. It's practically identical. The solution is, or if you have if you have an extra child, you offer up the child that you can't maintain in the hopes of securing a better future for the surviving children. And you kind of solve two problems at once, as it were. You get rid of that extra mouth to feed, and just possibly you have made the gods happy, and they bless you with increased fertility, specifically in your livestock and in your land, right? And if your livestock and your land do better, that means that you and your surviving family not only get to survive, but now actually get to do a little bit better, right? So again, it's twisted in perverse logic, but it's not completely out of left field. It helps us understand why would someone in the ancient world do that. Right, so in the case of sacrifice to Molech, there's a double perversion of the creative act going on, right? Piled on top of the idolatry itself. So Israelites choose to, who give their children to Molech, they choose to take their children, which they received through a creative act, and they destroy those children to appeal to a foreign god to fix the broken creation around them. Right, because again, notice the worry that they're going to starve to death is tied directly to the curse in Genesis 3. Right, by the sweat of your brow, you're going to work the land and get your food. And so you've got these two things that have broken down. You have human fertility, and you have the fertility of the land. And the pagans have come up with this kind of perverse way to try to work the system, and Israel buys into it. So again, remember, they're brought up in a pagan context, and they buy into what the pagans teach them, which is why they have to have the law. Right, so that's what's going on with Molech. Now, there's one more connection between sexual perversion and idolatry to consider in this text. The law that we've just read specifically forbids bestiality. And remember, if an ancient law code forbids something, that's a good indication to us that someone in the ancient world was actually doing that thing that had to be forbidden. And so just like we had to ask last week, why does incest have to be explicitly forbidden? Why is Israel engaged in that practice? We have to ask ourselves, all right, why is Israel engaging in bestiality? Because that's the implication. If it has to be forbidden, somebody's doing it. Is it just they're out in the wilderness and lonely? Well, no. There is a connection here back to, again, everything else that's been said in the text, along with this language about Molech. Remember that most idol worship, not just Molech worship, but most idol worship has some kind of sexual angle to it, whether it's indirect and implicit like Molech worship. Again, the idea is you sacrifice your fruit so that your land and your livestock will be fruitful. So it indirectly has to do with sex. But a lot of times, idolatry is explicitly sexual, right? Like in the form of cult prostitution, which we read about in the Old Testament. It's one of the many ways, by the way, in which the pagans take their incomplete understanding of God and just completely make a hash of things. All right, and this is going to sound shocking to begin with. It'll make sense. But the practice of cult prostitution and other kinds of sex acts tied to idolatry has a kernel of truth to it that has been taken way out into outer space, right? And just, the pagans take it to bizarro world. As we've seen in the creation account, sexuality is tied to the divine. And we talked about it a little bit. That the sex act is an imitation of the creative act. It tells us something about God's relationship with man, as we see later in the prophets. So that connection is there between sexuality and the divine. And the pagans discerned that principle in part, just enough to hang themselves with it, as it were, and ended up perverting it into things like cult prostitution and acts imitating sexual union with the gods. And so in some forms of pagan worship, there's this sense that you are, sexually becoming one with the gods. And there's, we could probably go deeper into this than you want to. Like in some pagan creation myths, the world is made up of semen of the gods. That one of the gods has an emission, and it turns into the world, right? So the pagans are taking something that, again, it has a kernel of truth to it, but just taking it in some really weird directions. And that's where bestiality steps in. And this is where the prohibition against bestiality is going to make more sense. Because consider how all of the pagan gods are represented in the ancient world. In all of the artwork that we have surviving of them. They are bulls and calves and birds and snakes and all kinds of other creatures. Goats. And in a pagan culture with zoomorphic gods, you're gonna have zoophilia. There's just no getting around it. And that's why the law of Moses has to include sexual prohibitions against bestiality. It is not just targeted against bestiality. It is also indirectly targeted against idolatrous thinking. Right? It's a both-and sort of thing. Right? It's a perverse act in and of itself, but in Israel's case, it represents an even deeper dysfunction having to do with the way that they look at the gods. So, what does Israel learn from all of these sexual laws that we've looked at today? Well, they learn what we learned last week from the creation account, that sexuality is an imitation of God because it participates in his creative act. It's the way in which God equips us to create life in imitation of him. All right, that's baked in, that's intended. And so mistreating the sexual relationship is, well, like the law makes the connections here, it's akin to idolatry. It is very closely related to sacrilege. And that's why the law takes it so seriously and talks about it at length, makes so many restrictions and prohibitions, and ties so much of it up in terms of clean and unclean, besides right and wrong, immoral and immoral. Right? So like uncleanness, sexual perversion makes a person unfit to approach the Lord. That's taught in the law. But sexual perversion is even more serious than uncleanness because it threatens to cut a person off from the congregation of Israel. Right? If you look at I'm not going to reread through the last part of Leviticus 18. But the consequences of these sins, it threatens to cut a person off from the congregation of Israel. It threatens to cut Israel off from the promised land. So in other words, in total, it threatens the relationship with God. It threatens to cut a person off, or the whole nation off, from the promises of God. So Israel learns that sexual perversion, again, it's akin to idolatry. It cuts them off. Israel also learns that these practices are an affront to God, regardless of who practices them. And it's part of this warning at the end of Leviticus chapter 18. Right? God says, don't any of y'all do these things, but also don't allow any of the foreigners or sojourners among you to do these things. Nobody in the land is supposed to do these things. Doesn't matter what your status is. Don't do any of these things. Furthermore, God says, the pagans who lived in the promised land did these things. And so I kicked them out of the land because they did these things. And if y'all do these things, I'm going to kick you out of the land too. All right, that's my executive Southern summary of the end of Leviticus 18. Right, the strong implication here is that these don't just teach us about the moral law, but they are actually part of the moral law. Right? They're not just ritual laws meant to be training wheels to teach Israel about the moral law, like the dietary laws were. So in this way, the sexual laws differ from some of the cleanliness laws. So how much of this carries forward to Christian ethics in the New Testament? And I think we've basically just answered that. Because almost everything that we read here in Leviticus 18 is repeated explicitly in the New Testament. Right? All of those prohibitions that we read against incest, we find those talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We also find them talked about in the Gospels when King Herod takes his brother Philip's wife. Right? They're flatly prohibited. The prohibitions against adultery and homosexuality are also explicitly repeated in multiple places in the New Testament. Right? So consider places like Romans 1, talking about homosexuality. Or, and I should have written down a scripture reference for this, but in the Gospels, Jesus is asked, whether it is lawful to divorce a woman for any reason. Right? And he lays it out. No, it's not for any reason. Right? He also clarifies in the Sermon on the Mount that adultery is not just the act of intercourse with a woman who's not your wife, who's someone else's wife, but looking lustfully after another woman makes an adulterer of you and makes an adulteress of her. Right, so these prohibitions are explicitly repeated, and in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, even amplified. Right, now, even the things that are not explicitly mentioned in the New Testament that we read about in Leviticus 18, things like bestiality and child sacrifice, have always been condemned by Christians everywhere. Right, so for example, we find abortion condemned in the Didache, which was likely written in the very early 2nd century. And in the New Testament, we're not given any kind of reason to believe that any of these sexual restrictions have changed. We're not given any reason to believe that they are not part of the moral law, that there's really any kind of gray area here. The only real change that we see, again, deals with the clean and unclean laws, some of them at least, in Leviticus 15. And mainly just the idea that any kind of sex, even marital sex, would make a person unclean. Again, we don't see that reflected in the New Testament. But otherwise, a lot of these principles, and especially these moral restrictions in Leviticus 18, I'd have to say generally still binding. So that wraps us up for our study of the sexual laws. There's more that we could read. We're not going to read through all of them. We will pick up, I think, a few more things dealing specifically with adultery in some of our following classes, because next week, Lord willing, we're going to start looking at some of the marriage laws, and we'll probably go back and look at the Sota ordeal in Numbers 5 again, because it's an adultery law, and it factors into our discussion of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But we're going to start looking at those things, again, Lord willing, next week. I hope that this study has been useful and edifying and has perhaps made some things about the law clearer. And hopefully I've not made a muddled mess of everything. So we all, again, as we approach the Word of God, we just pray that we're able to discern things faithfully, and that we're able to submit ourselves to God and discern His will, so that we can be better servants in His kingdom, so that we can be spiritually clean, so that we can be holy and not affront our Lord. So that's the aim of all of this study, and I hope that has been accomplished in our study today. I look forward to seeing you again soon, and until then, take care. Bye-bye.